The courthouse clock struck 11 as Mark and Elena Vasquez counted their crumpled bills one final time. $1,000, every penny they'd scraped together after losing their city jobs 3 months earlier. Mark's construction company had folded when the economy tanked. Elena's engineering firm had let her go the same week. Now they sat in folding chairs in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by locals who knew better than to bid on cursed ground. Next item on the auction block. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the half-empty room. 40 acres on Millfield Road, including farmhouse and outbuildings. Property's been abandoned since 1987. Starting bid is $1,500. Elena's heart sank. They were short by 500. She squeezed Mark's calloused hand, feeling their last hope slipping away. They'd driven 8 hours from the city to this auction, camping in their truck for 2 nights, surviving on gas station coffee and determination. The silence stretched uncomfortably. No paddles rose. The locals shifted in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. Everyone in the county had heard the stories about the Millfield property, how the previous owners, the Morrison family, had vanished overnight without explanation, how strange sounds echoed across the fields on moonless nights, how 3 different families had tried to farm that land over the decades, and all had fled within months. Anyone? 40 acres, good soil, existing structures, 1,500 to start. Still nothing. The auctioneer loosened his tie, clearly eager to move on to properties people actually wanted. "I'll take it for 1,000, Mark called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "That's all we have." The room turned to stare. An elderly farmer in overalls shook his head sadly. A woman in the front row whispered something about city folks not knowing what they were getting into. "Sir, the minimum bid is 1,500, the auctioneer replied. Elena stood up, her engineering background making her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We've researched the property records. It's been on the market for 3 years. No bids. The county just wants it off their books and back on the tax rolls." The auctioneer glanced at the county clerk, who shrugged wearily. After 16 years of paying for maintenance on an abandoned property, they were losing money every month, going once for $1,000. The auctioneer's gavel hesitated in the air, going twice. "Don't do it, young man." The elderly farmer stood up, his weathered face serious. "That ground ain't right. The Morrisons were good people, been farming that land for generations." Then one morning, neighbors found their truck running in the driveway, front door wide open, breakfast still warm on the table. They were just gone. Mark felt Elena's grip tighten on his arm, but they'd come too far to turn back now. They needed this land, needed a chance to build something sustainable, something their own. The city had chewed them up and spit them out. This was their shot at a different life, sold to the couple in the back for $1,000. The gavel came down with finality. Elena's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror. They'd just bought 40 acres of supposedly cursed farmland with their last $1,000. 2 hours later, they stood in the overgrown driveway, staring at their new home. The farmhouse sagged like an old man's shoulders, its white paint peeling in long strips. Weeds choked the foundation. Windows stared back at them like hollow eyes. But the bones were good. Elena could see it with her trained eye. The structure was sound, the foundation solid. The barn in the distance looked sturdy despite decades of neglect. 40 acres of fertile soil stretched beyond the buildings, waiting for someone to coax life from the earth again. "It's not exactly what we pictured," Mark said, trying to inject humor into his voice. Elena walked to the front porch, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. We'll make it work. We have to. They spent their first week camping inside the farmhouse, sleeping in their tent on the living room floor. Mark focused on getting basic utilities running, while Elena assessed the structural integrity of every building. It was during one of these inspections that she noticed something odd about the barn. The foundation didn't match the property records. According to the county files, the barn had been built in 1952 on a standard concrete foundation. But as Elena walked the perimeter, her engineer's eye caught details that didn't add up. The stones weren't concrete at all. They were limestone blocks, fitted together with precision that spoke of much older construction techniques. Elena knelt beside the barn's northeast corner, running her hands over stones that shouldn't exist. In 15 years of structural engineering, she'd inspected hundreds of farm buildings across 3 states. She knew concrete foundations, steel reinforcement, modern construction techniques. This wasn't any of those things. These limestone blocks were massive, some weighing several tons, fitted together without a trace of mortar. The joints were so precise she couldn't slide a knife blade between them. The craftsmanship reminded her of ancient Roman architecture she'd studied in college, or the Inca stonework she'd seen in textbooks. But this was rural Pennsylvania, not the Mediterranean or the Andes. Mark, you need to see this. He emerged from under the farmhouse where he'd been wrestling with corroded plumbing. His hands were black with rust and decades of accumulated grime. What's wrong now? Please tell me the barn isn't about to collapse, too. Elena stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Look at these stones. Really look at them. Mark squatted beside the foundation, his construction background making him examine the work with a professional eye. The longer he looked, the more his expression changed, from casual interest to confusion. This isn't right, he said finally. These blocks are cut too precisely. The fitting is too perfect. And look at the size of them. How did farmers in 1952 move stones this massive without heavy equipment? Elena pulled out her phone and showed him the property records they'd downloaded from the county website. According to this, your grandfather built this barn on a standard concrete foundation, poured in place, reinforced with steel rebar. Standard post-war construction. Mark studied the documents, then looked back at the stones. But this is clearly much older work. The technique, the materials, even the way they're weathered. This looks like it's been here for centuries, not decades. That's what I'm thinking too. Elena walked along the foundation's perimeter, counting her steps. And there's something else. The footprint is wrong. What do you mean? The barn above ground is 30 by 40 feet. But this stone foundation extends at least 10 feet beyond that in every direction. It's like the current barn was built on top of something much larger. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. He'd always been practical, focused on concrete problems with tangible solutions. But standing here, looking at stonework that defied explanation, he felt like they'd stumbled into someone else's mystery. Maybe the previous owners knew something about this, Elena suggested. The Morrisons farmed here for generations. They must have noticed the foundation didn't match the records. Mark remembered the old farmer's warning at the auction, the way his weathered face had gone serious when he'd talked about the family's disappearance. That ground ain't right, he'd said. Maybe he'd meant more than just superstition. Over the next few days, Mark threw himself into investigating the mystery with the same intensity he'd once brought to construction projects. He'd bought a metal detector years earlier, thinking he might search for lost tools around job sites. Now he used it to sweep the area around the barn's perimeter. The detector went crazy. Buried just inches beneath the soil, Mark found fragments of worked metal unlike anything he'd seen. Pieces of copper and bronze, green with age, decorated with symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet he recognized. Some fragments were clearly parts of larger objects, tools, or decorative items, broken and scattered as if they'd been hastily buried. Elena examined each find with scientific precision, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. Her engineering background had taught her to approach problems systematically, to gather data before drawing conclusions. But the data they were gathering made no sense within any framework she understood. The pottery shards were the most puzzling. Mark's detector led them to dozens of fragments, all buried in a rough circle around the barn. Elena had taken enough archaeology electives in college to recognize that these weren't typical Native American ceramics. The clay was different, fired at higher temperatures than local tribes typically used. The decorative patterns were complex, geometric designs that seemed to blend influences from multiple cultures. I think we need to talk to someone who knows the local history, Elena said one evening as they sorted through the day's finds. Someone who might have heard stories the county records don't include. Mark had been thinking the same thing. He'd noticed how the locals at the auction had exchanged glances when their property was mentioned. The kind of looks that suggested shared knowledge, stories passed down through generations. They found Margaret Henley at the County Historical Society, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who'd lived in the area her entire life. When Mark and Elena spread their photographs across her desk, her expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching alarm. "Where exactly did you find these?" she asked, studying the metal fragments and pottery shards. "Our property, the old Morrison place on Millfield Road." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the desk. She seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision. "The Morrisons came to me 3 times in the months before they disappeared," she said finally. Tom Morrison was convinced there were underground chambers beneath their barn. He'd found artifacts just like these. Said he could hear sounds at night, like voices echoing from below ground. Elena leaned forward. "What did you tell them?" Margaret sighed. "I told them what I tell everyone who brings me stories like that. Local folklore. Probably just natural caves filled with debris from old settlements. But Tom was insistent. He said the artifacts proved there was something significant down there, something that predated any known settlement in the area." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "Did they ever investigate further?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. "That's the thing. Tom called me the week before they vanished. Said he'd found a way into the chambers. He was excited, talking about making some kind of discovery that would change everything." Then they were gone. The room fell silent except for the tick of an old clock on Margaret's desk. Elena stared at the photographs of their finds, her mind racing through the implications. "We think the barn foundation is much older than the records show," she said quietly, "and much larger." Margaret nodded slowly. Tom Morrison thought the same thing. He believed that barn was built on top of something ancient, something that was meant to stay hidden. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it torrential rains that turned their dirt driveway into a muddy river. Mark and Elena had spent the winter months settling into the farmhouse, patching roof leaks and wrestling with temperamental plumbing. They'd grown comfortable with their strange property, even fond of the mysterious stone foundation that had sparked so many questions. But the rain changed everything. Ellen awoke on a gray April morning to the sound of rushing water where there should have been silence. She pulled on her boots and stepped onto the back porch, expecting to see the usual spring flooding in the low-lying fields. Instead, she found Mark standing motionless near the barn, staring at something that made her stomach drop. The ground had opened up. Where solid earth had existed the day before, a gaping hole now yawned like a hungry mouth. The sinkhole was roughly circular, maybe 8 feet across, located precisely at the barn's northeast corner where Elena had first noticed the unusual stonework. Mark heard her approaching footsteps and turned, his face pale with excitement and fear. Elena, you need to see this, but be careful. The edges are still unstable. She crept forward, testing each step on the rain-soaked ground. The closer she got, the more her engineering instincts screamed warnings. Sinkholes were dangerous, unpredictable. They could expand without notice, swallowing buildings, vehicles, people. But as she peered over the edge, her professional caution gave way to wonder. 20 feet below, illuminated by the gray morning light, she could see worked stone. Not the rough field stone typical of old farm foundations, but carefully carved blocks forming what looked like the entrance to a tunnel. The stonework was partially buried under centuries of accumulated soil, but enough was visible to confirm what she'd suspected all winter. Their barn sat on top of something much older and much larger than anyone had imagined. Mark had already rigged a rope around the nearest fence post. I went down about 10 feet this morning, just to get a better look. Elena, those stones down there, they're not random, they're deliberate. There's a pattern, like they're forming some kind of entrance. Elena's mind raced through the structural implications. If there were significant underground chambers beneath their property, it could explain the mysterious foundation. It could also mean their barn was at risk of collapse if the underground spaces weren't properly supported. "We need to call someone," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure who. The county? The state archaeological department? The university? Mark's expression grew troubled. "I've been thinking about that all morning. Remember what Margaret Henley said about the Morrisons? They found evidence of underground chambers and started asking questions. Then they disappeared." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp morning air. "You think someone made them disappear?" "I think," Mark said slowly, "that once certain people know what's down there, we might lose control of our own property. Government agencies, academic institutions, they all have ways of claiming jurisdiction over significant archaeological sites." Elena understood his concern. They'd bought this land as their refuge, their chance to build an independent life. If they reported the discovery, they might find themselves evicted from their own home in the name of historical preservation or scientific research. "But we can't just ignore it," she said. "If there are significant archaeological remains down there, we have a responsibility to preserve them properly." Mark tested the rope's tension against the fence post. "What if we explore it ourselves first? Just to understand what we're dealing with before we involve anyone else?" Elena's engineering background made her acutely aware of the dangers. Underground spaces could contain toxic gases, unstable structures, or deep water. They could easily become trapped or injured with no one knowing where to look for them. But her curiosity was stronger than her caution. "If we do this, we do it right," she said firmly. "Proper safety equipment, communication plan, someone who knows where we are and when to expect us back." Mark nodded eagerly. "I've got climbing gear from my construction days, helmets, lights, safety harnesses, and my brother knows we're here. We could call him before we go down, tell him to check on us if he doesn't hear from us by evening." Elena walked around the sinkhole's perimeter, her trained eye assessing the stability of the surrounding ground. The collapse seemed to have relieved pressure in the immediate area, making further cave-ins less likely in the short term. But they'd need to move quickly before the next heavy rain. "One reconnaissance trip," she said finally. "We go down, we look around, we document what we find, and then we decide how to proceed." Mark's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. "This could be it, Elena. This could be the discovery that changes everything for us." Elena stared into the dark opening that had appeared overnight in their backyard. She had no idea how prophetic his words would prove to be. Mark and Elena spent 2 days preparing for their descent into the unknown. Mark retrieved his construction safety gear from storage, checking every carabiner and testing every rope. Elena researched cave exploration protocols online, printing out emergency procedures and safety checklists. They bought additional equipment from the outdoor store in town: extra batteries, waterproof lights, emergency blankets, and a first aid kit designed for wilderness use. On the morning of their planned exploration, they called Mark's brother in the city, explaining their situation without revealing too much detail. "If you don't hear from us by 8 tonight, call the county sheriff and tell them to check the Morrison property on Millfield Road," Mark said into the phone. "We're doing some structural investigation work that might be dangerous." Elena had spent the previous evening studying topographical maps and geological surveys of their area. The limestone bedrock beneath their property was known for creating natural cave systems, but nothing in the official record suggested anything as extensive as what they suspected lay beneath their barn. They began their descent at dawn, when the morning light provided the best natural illumination of the sinkhole's depths. Mark went first, his construction experience making him comfortable with ropes and heights. Elena followed, her engineering background helping her assess the stability of the ancient stonework as they descended. The tunnel entrance was even more impressive up close. The carved stones formed an archway nearly 7 feet tall, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each block fitted with precision that would challenge modern stonemasons. Most remarkably, after what must have been centuries underground, the structure showed no signs of collapse or significant deterioration. Mark's flashlight beam swept across symbols carved into the archway's keystone. They looked almost like writing, but in no script either of them recognized. The marks were deep, deliberate, clearly meaningful to whoever had created them. "This wasn't built by local farmers," Elena whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is the work of master craftsmen, people with advanced knowledge of engineering and construction." The tunnel beyond the entrance sloped gently downward, following what seemed to be a natural contour in the bedrock. The walls were a mixture of carved stone and natural limestone, worked together so seamlessly it was difficult to tell where human construction ended and natural cave formation began. After 50 feet, the tunnel opened into their first chamber. Elena's flashlight beam swept across walls covered in intricate carvings that took her breath away. The images were complex, detailed, telling stories she couldn't begin to interpret. Human figures engaged in activities she didn't recognize, animals that might have been local species or might have been something else entirely, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse and shift in the moving light. Mark pulled out his camera and began documenting everything systematically. The flash illuminated details their flashlights had missed, revealing layers of carving that suggested the chamber had been decorated over many years, perhaps many generations. But it was the artifacts scattered across the chamber floor that truly stunned them. Pottery vessels sat where they'd been placed centuries ago, some intact, others broken, but with all the pieces present. The ceramic work was sophisticated, decorated with the same complex patterns they'd found in fragments around the barn. Tools lay nearby, implements made from stone, bone, and metal that showed clear signs of regular use. Elena knelt beside a collection of textiles that should have crumbled to dust centuries ago, but remained remarkably preserved. The fabric was woven from fibers she couldn't identify, dyed in colors that remained vibrant despite the passage of time. The patterns were geometric, similar to the wall carvings, but more intricate, suggesting a highly developed artistic tradition. "Mark, look at this," she called softly, her voice filled with wonder. "These aren't just random artifacts. This is evidence of a sophisticated culture, people with advanced skills in multiple crafts." Mark joined her, his camera flash revealing more details with each shot. The preservation is incredible. In most archaeological sites, organic materials like textiles and wood decay completely within decades. But these look like they were placed here yesterday. Elena's engineering mind was already working on the puzzle. She walked the chamber's perimeter, her flashlight beam tracing the walls and ceiling. The ventilation system was the key. Somehow, the ancient builders had created a circulation system that maintained consistent temperature and humidity levels. Fresh air moved through the chamber in patterns she could feel but not yet understand. The sophistication of the environmental controls suggested knowledge of engineering principles that weren't supposed to exist in pre-Columbian North America. Yet the evidence was undeniable, preserved in stone and maintained by systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries. As they explored deeper into the chamber, Mark discovered something that made him call Elena over urgently. In an alcove near the back wall, partially hidden behind a fallen stone, he'd found human remains. The skeleton was intact, positioned deliberately rather than collapsed naturally. The individual had been placed on a stone platform, surrounded by artifacts that suggested high status or special significance. Jewelry made from materials Mark didn't recognize, tools crafted with extraordinary skill, and most remarkably, a collection of stone tablets covered in the same pictographic writing they'd seen throughout the chamber. Elena approached the remains with the reverence they deserved. "This person wasn't just buried here," she said quietly. "They were honored. Look at the positioning, the grave goods, the care taken in the placement. This was someone important to the community that built this place." Mark continued photographing, but more carefully now, aware they were documenting not just archaeological artifacts, but someone's final resting place. The implications of their discovery were becoming clear. They hadn't just found evidence of an unknown culture. They'd found what appeared to be an intact burial chamber, possibly the most significant archaeological discovery in North American history. But as they stood in that ancient chamber, surrounded by evidence of a lost civilization, both Mark and Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. They were no longer just property owners who'd stumbled upon something interesting. They were the guardians of irreplaceable human heritage, and every decision they made from this point forward would determine whether this remarkable discovery would be preserved or destroyed. The tunnel beyond the burial chamber descended more steeply, carved steps worn smooth by countless footsteps over centuries. Mark and Elena moved carefully, their flashlight beams revealing a passage that grew wider and taller with each step. The air current was stronger here, carrying hints of a vast space ahead. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The tunnel opened into a cavern so enormous their flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls. But this wasn't a natural cave formation. As they stepped onto a stone platform at the tunnel's mouth, their lights revealed the impossible truth spread out below them. They were looking down into an underground city. Stone buildings rose from the cavern floor in orderly rows, their roof lines creating a geometric pattern that spoke of careful urban planning. Streets paved with fitted stones ran between structures of varying sizes, from small residential buildings to massive complexes that might have been temples or administrative centers. Elaborate drainage channels carved into the bedrock carried water through the settlement, feeding fountains and pools that still held crystal clear water after centuries of abandonment. Elena's knees went weak. She sat down hard on the stone platform, her engineering mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "You can't build something this extensive underground without massive excavation equipment, without structural supports, without engineering knowledge that didn't exist in pre-Columbian America." Mark was already moving, his camera flash illuminating section after section of the incredible vista. The city stretched in all directions, disappearing into darkness beyond their light's reach. From their elevated position, they could see the settlement was organized into distinct districts: residential areas with small, uniform buildings, workshop districts where larger structures suggested specialized crafts, a central plaza dominated by a stepped pyramid that rose nearly to the cavern's ceiling. The architecture was unlike anything either of them had seen in textbooks or museums. The buildings showed influences from multiple cultures, as if the city's builders had drawn inspiration from across the ancient world. Some structures displayed the precise stonework they'd seen in the burial chamber, reminiscent of Incan construction. Others featured arched doorways and vaulted ceilings that suggested Roman influence. Still others incorporated design elements that looked almost Celtic, with spiraling decorative patterns carved into door frames and window openings. But it was the scale that truly took their breath away. This wasn't a small settlement or temporary shelter. This was a major population center, a city that must have housed thousands of people. The infrastructure alone represented decades of construction by skilled craftsmen working with sophisticated tools and techniques. Elena forced herself to stand, her scientific training overriding her shock. "We need to document everything systematically: the layout, the construction techniques, the architectural styles. This is the most significant archaeological discovery in North American history." Mark was already thinking the same way. He began taking photographs from multiple angles, creating a visual record of the city's overall plan. But even with his camera's flash, they could only capture small sections at a time. The settlement was simply too vast to document from their current position. "We need to go down there," he said, pointing to a stone stairway that descended from their platform to the city's main thoroughfare. "We need to see the construction up close, understand how they built all this." Elena's engineering instincts warred with her curiosity. The cavern's ceiling was supported by natural limestone formations and carefully placed stone pillars, but she couldn't assess the structural integrity from a distance. For all they knew, the entire complex could be on the verge of collapse. But her need to understand overcame her caution. The descent took 20 minutes, the stone steps worn smooth by countless feet over centuries. As they reached street level, the city's sophistication became even more apparent. The paving stones were fitted with the same precision they'd seen in the barn foundation, creating surfaces that remained level and intact despite the passage of time. Storm drains carved into the bedrock carried away any water that seeped through the limestone above. The residential buildings were marvels of engineering efficiency. Each structure was built around a central courtyard that provided light and ventilation. Rooms were connected by passages that allowed air to circulate naturally, maintaining comfortable temperatures year-round. Many buildings still contained furniture, carved from stone and wood that had been preserved by the cavern's stable environment. Mark explored the workshop district while Elena examined the water management system. The craftsmen's quarters revealed evidence of sophisticated metalworking, pottery production, textile weaving, and stone carving. Tools lay on workbenches as if their owners had stepped away moments ago. Half-finished projects suggested the city had been abandoned suddenly, but not in panic or disaster. Elena's investigation of the water system revealed engineering knowledge that shouldn't have existed in ancient America. The builders had tapped into underground springs, channeling fresh water through carved channels that maintained perfect flow rates. Overflow systems prevented flooding during heavy rains. Settlement ponds allowed sediment to clear before water reached residential areas. The entire network was designed and built by people who understood hydraulic engineering principles that weren't rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. But it was in the central plaza that they made their most stunning discovery. The stepped pyramid at the city's heart was covered in carvings that told the settlement's story. Elena and Mark climbed the stone steps slowly, their flashlight beams revealing layer upon layer of pictographic writing. The images showed the city's construction, its daily life, its ceremonies and celebrations. But more remarkably, they showed contact with the outside world. Ships with unfamiliar designs brought visitors from across oceans. Traders carried goods that could only have come from distant continents. Maps carved into the pyramid's walls showed geographical knowledge that extended far beyond North America, including landmasses and coastlines that suggested global exploration and trade networks. Mark photographed every carving while Elena studied the construction techniques used in the pyramid itself. The massive stones had been quarried elsewhere and transported through the tunnel systems. The engineering required to move blocks weighing several tons through underground passages spoke of organizational abilities and technical knowledge that challenged everything they thought they knew about ancient American civilizations. As they stood atop the pyramid, looking out over the underground city, Both Mark and Elena felt the weight of their discovery settling on them like a physical burden. They had stumbled upon evidence that could rewrite the history of human civilization in the Americas. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was proof of advanced cultures, international trade, and engineering capabilities that predated European contact by centuries. But they were also acutely aware of their isolation 20 feet underground, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization that had vanished without explanation. Whatever had caused the original inhabitants to abandon this magnificent city, they had sealed it carefully, preserving it for future discovery. Now Mark and Elena were the discoverers, and the responsibility for protecting this irreplaceable heritage rested entirely on their shoulders. The deepest tunnel they'd discovered led away from the central plaza, descending through carved passages that grew more elaborate with each step. The walls here were covered in symbols that seemed different from those in the upper city, more complex and ritualistic. Mark's flashlight beam caught glints of metal inlaid into the stone carvings, precious metals that had somehow avoided tarnishing over the centuries. Elena noticed the air quality changing as they descended. The ventilation system down here was even more sophisticated, with carefully positioned openings that created gentle currents, carrying fresh air through the passages. But there was something else in the air, a faint sweetness that reminded her of incense or ceremonial herbs. The tunnel ended at massive double doors, each carved from a single piece of stone and decorated with intricate reliefs that told stories neither of them could interpret. The doors stood slightly ajar, as if whoever had last passed through had left them open intentionally. Mark pushed gently, and the massive stones swung inward on hinges so perfectly balanced they moved at the touch of his fingertips. Beyond lay a chamber unlike anything they'd seen in the city above. The room was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose into darkness above their lights. But it was the chamber's sole occupant that made them both stop breathing. In the center of the room, on a raised stone platform, lay the perfectly preserved remains of a human figure. Not skeletal remains like they'd found in the upper chamber, but an individual so well preserved they might have been sleeping rather than dead for centuries. Elena approached slowly, her scientific training warring with an instinctive reverence for what was clearly a sacred space. The preservation was impossible by any standard she understood. The figure's clothing, skin, even hair remained intact, as if some process had stopped time itself within this chamber. The individual had been tall, probably male, dressed in robes made from fabric that seemed to shift color in their flashlight beams. Jewelry adorned his neck and wrists, pieces crafted from metals Elena couldn't identify, and stones that seemed to hold their own inner light. But it was his position that spoke most clearly of his importance. His hands rested on a collection of stone tablets arranged carefully across his chest. Each tablet was covered in the same pictographic writing they'd seen throughout the city, but these symbols were more elaborate, more detailed. This wasn't everyday communication. These were records of profound importance, knowledge that someone had deemed essential to preserve. Mark circled the platform slowly, documenting everything with his camera. The flash revealed details their flashlights had missed. The chamber walls were covered in astronomical charts showing star positions and planetary movements. Mathematical equations were carved into the stone, formulas that seemed to describe complex engineering principles. Most remarkably, there were maps showing not just the local area, but what appeared to be global geography, including continents and coastlines that suggested knowledge of the entire world. Elena studied the preservation technology with growing amazement. The chamber was a marvel of environmental control. Hidden vents maintained perfect air circulation. The stone platform incorporated channels that carried away any moisture that might threaten the remains. Most incredibly, the entire room seemed to be maintained at a constant temperature that prevented decay without freezing. "This isn't just a burial chamber," she whispered. "It's a repository. Someone designed this place to preserve knowledge, to keep these records safe for future discovery." Mark focused his camera on the tablets, capturing every symbol and marking. The stone tablets proved to be the key that unlocked the underground city's most shocking secret. Mark and Elena spent 3 days photographing every symbol, every carving, every astronomical chart in the Guardian's chamber, before carefully removing soil samples and organic fragments for testing. Elena's engineering background had taught her the importance of precise documentation, but nothing had prepared her for what the evidence would reveal. The carbon dating results arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a discreet laboratory Elena had contacted through her former university connections. She read the report 3 times before calling Mark into their makeshift office in the farmhouse kitchen. "The organic materials from the Guardian's chamber date to approximately 950 CE, she said, her voice barely steady. "The textiles, the wooden artifacts, even the preserved remains themselves. They're over 1,000 years old." Mark stared at the laboratory report, trying to process what Elena was telling him. That would place the city's occupation between 800 and 1200 CE. But that's impossible. There weren't any advanced civilizations in North America during that period. The major Native American settlements didn't develop until centuries later. Elena spread additional test results across their kitchen table. "That's what I thought too. But the evidence doesn't lie. Multiple samples from different areas of the city all show the same time frame. This underground settlement was thriving when Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages. The implications were staggering. According to accepted historical understanding, the most advanced North American civilizations during that period were the ancestral Puebloan cultures in the Southwest and the emerging Mississippian settlements in the Ohio River Valley. Nothing approaching the sophistication of their underground city should have existed in Pennsylvania for another 300 years. But the carbon dating was just the beginning of the impossibilities. Mark had been researching the artifacts they'd found, comparing the metalwork and pottery to known archaeological examples. The results challenged everything they thought they knew about ancient American cultures. The bronze work showed techniques that weren't supposed to exist in the Americas until European contact. The steel tools displayed metallurgical knowledge that predated known steel production in North America by centuries. Even more puzzling were the clear influences from distant civilizations. Elena had found pottery shards decorated with patterns identical to Celtic designs from Ireland and Scotland. Stone carvings in the workshop district showed architectural elements common in Roman construction, but unknown in pre-Columbian America. Most remarkably, several artifacts displayed characteristics typical of Mayan craftsmanship, despite being located thousands of miles from any known Mayan settlement. The astronomical charts in the Guardian's chamber posed their own mysteries. Elena had consulted with an astronomy professor at the state university, sending photographs without revealing their source. The star maps showed knowledge of celestial mechanics that shouldn't have existed in medieval America. The calculations demonstrated understanding of planetary movements, eclipse predictions, and navigational techniques that suggested regular long-distance travel. But it was the global geography that truly defied explanation. The maps carved into the Guardian's chamber walls showed not just North America, but accurate representations of South American coastlines, European river systems, and what appeared to be African mountain ranges. One particularly detailed carving seemed to depict the Mediterranean Sea with remarkable accuracy, including islands and peninsulas that could only have been mapped through direct observation. Mark traced the carved coastlines with his finger, comparing them to modern maps on his laptop. These people knew the shape of continents they shouldn't have been able to reach. They understood global geography centuries before European exploration supposedly opened those trade routes. Elena's research into similar underground cities had yielded equally disturbing results. Through careful searches of archaeological databases and historical records, she'd discovered references to comparable sites across the world: underground settlements in Turkey, carved cities in China, subterranean complexes in South America, all dating to roughly the same period and all mysteriously abandoned around 1200 CE. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Something had connected these distant civilizations, some network of trade or communication that had spanned continents during a period when such contact was supposed to be impossible. What happened to them? Mark asked one evening as they studied the evidence spread across their dining room table. All these advanced civilizations, all this sophisticated technology and knowledge, where did it all go? Elena had been wondering the same thing. The abandonment patterns suggested coordination, as if communities across the world had simultaneously decided to seal their underground cities and disappear. But the preservation efforts, the careful environmental controls, the detailed records left behind, all indicated they expected someone to eventually find and understand their legacy. Maybe they didn't disappear, Elena said slowly. Maybe they just went deeper underground. Or maybe they left this continent entirely, taking their knowledge with them. The possibility that advanced civilizations had existed in ancient America, had maintained global trade networks, and had possessed technological knowledge that surpassed medieval European capabilities, challenged fundamental assumptions about human history. Their underground city wasn't just an archaeological anomaly. It was evidence of a lost chapter in human development, a sophisticated global culture that had thrived and vanished centuries before Columbus ever set sail. As Mark and Elena sat in their farmhouse kitchen, surrounded by photographs and test results that could rewrite history books, they realized their simple dream of sustainable farming had transformed into something far more significant. They weren't just property owners anymore. They were the guardians of proof that human civilization was far older, far more advanced, and far more interconnected than anyone had imagined. Mark stared at his laptop screen, cursor blinking on an empty email addressed to the Pennsylvania Historical Commission. For 3 days, he'd tried to write the message that would change everything. Subject line: Significant archaeological discovery requires immediate investigation. But every time he started typing, Elena's warnings echoed in his mind. Once we send this, we lose control, she'd said that morning over coffee, her engineer's pragmatism cutting through his excitement. Government agencies will descend on our property like locusts. They'll declare it a protected site, establish security perimeters, bring in their own teams. We'll become spectators to our own discovery. Mark understood her concerns. He'd spent enough time dealing with building inspectors and zoning officials to know how quickly bureaucracy could steamroll individual property rights. But the weight of what they'd found beneath their barn felt crushing. Every day they delayed reporting the underground city was another day that irreplaceable archaeological evidence remained vulnerable to damage, deterioration, or worse. The academic world posed its own dangers. Elena had been quietly reaching out to former colleagues, testing the waters without revealing specifics. The responses had been troubling. Universities were struggling for funding, desperate for discoveries that could generate research grants and media attention. A find of this magnitude would trigger a feeding frenzy among competing institutions, each claiming expertise and demanding access. Remember what happened to that farmer in Ohio who found the Native American burial ground? Elena had shown him news articles about property seizures, legal battles that lasted years, families driven into bankruptcy fighting to retain ownership of land that had been in their families for generations. The farmer had done the right thing, reported his discovery immediately. 2 years later, he was living in a trailer while archaeologists turned his ancestral farm into a research station. But the alternative felt equally impossible. Mark walked through their underground city each morning, documenting new details, photographing artifacts that could revolutionize understanding of ancient American civilizations. The responsibility was becoming unbearable. They weren't trained archaeologists. They had no expertise in preservation techniques, no knowledge of proper excavation protocols. Every footstep they took might be destroying evidence that could never be recovered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena had been researching similar discoveries worldwide, looking for examples of how other property owners had handled comparable situations. She'd found a case study from Turkey where a homeowner had discovered the underground city of Derinkuyu during basement renovations. Instead of immediately contacting government authorities, the family had spent months documenting everything themselves before carefully selecting a small team of trusted experts to verify their findings. The key had been maintaining control throughout the process. They'd partnered with ethical archaeologists who respected property rights, worked with local communities rather than displacing them, and focused on preservation rather than exploitation. The site had eventually gained UNESCO World Heritage status, but the original family remained involved as partners rather than being pushed aside as obstacles. That's our model, Elena said, showing Mark the research. We document everything ourselves first. We understand what we have completely. Then we approach people we can trust, individuals rather than institutions. We maintain ownership and control while ensuring proper preservation and study. Mark felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't about hiding their discovery or avoiding responsibility. It was about being smart, protecting both the archaeological site and their own interests while ensuring the underground city received the attention and preservation it deserved. They began reaching out carefully, using Elena's professional network to identify archaeologists with reputations for ethical practice and community collaboration. Dr. Sarah Running Bear at the University of New Mexico had spent her career working with Native American tribes, ensuring indigenous communities maintained control over their ancestral sites while facilitating respectful scientific study. Dr. Marcus Webb specialized in pre Columbian civilizations and had written extensively about the importance of property owner rights in archaeological discoveries. The initial conversations were promising. Both academics expressed genuine excitement about the preliminary evidence Mark and Elena shared. But more importantly, they understood the couple's concerns about maintaining control over their property. They suggested forming a private foundation that would fund proper excavation and study while keeping ownership in Mark and Elena's hands. The local Native American communities provided another crucial perspective. Elena had contacted the tribal council representing the original inhabitants of their region, expecting resistance or claims to the underground city. Instead, she found thoughtful partners who understood the complexity of the situation. "This isn't our ancestors' work," explained Thomas Crowfeather, the tribal historian who visited their property to examine the evidence. "The construction techniques, the artifacts, the time frame, none of it matches our people's traditions. But it's still sacred ground, still part of this land's story. We want to see it preserved and studied respectfully, with proper ceremonies and acknowledgement of all the peoples who have called this place home." The Tribal Council offered to serve as cultural consultants, ensuring any excavation respected indigenous protocols while helping to authenticate the site's significance. Their involvement would provide crucial legitimacy when dealing with government agencies and academic institutions. Mark and Elena spent weeks developing their strategy. They would complete their own documentation first, creating a comprehensive record of everything they'd discovered. Then they would approach their selected experts individually, building a team of trusted partners before making any public announcements. The tribal council would be involved from the beginning, ensuring cultural sensitivity and community support. Most importantly, they would establish their private foundation before revealing the site's existence to government authorities. With proper legal structures in place, academic partnerships established, and community support secured, they could control how their discovery was studied and preserved. It wasn't the simple solution Mark had initially wanted, but as he deleted that unsent email to the Historical Commission, he realized they'd found something better, a path that honored both their responsibilities as discoverers and their rights as property owners, ensuring the underground city would receive the protection and study it deserved while allowing them to remain its guardians. 3 months into their careful documentation process, Elena began waking up at 3 in the morning with her heart racing. She'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through endless scenarios of what could go wrong. Government seizure of their property, academic institutions fighting over research rights, media attention that would destroy their quiet life. The weight of safeguarding what might be the most significant archaeological discovery in North American history was crushing her. Mark found her one morning sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by photographs and research notes, her hands shaking as she tried to drink her coffee. She'd been down in the underground city until nearly midnight, obsessively documenting every carving in the Guardian's chamber for the fourth time. "Elena, you need to sleep," he said gently, sitting beside her. "We've photographed everything 3 times over. The documentation is complete. But what if we missed something? What if there are details that could be crucial for understanding the site's significance?" She gestured frantically at the papers covering their table. "What if our amateur documentation isn't sufficient for proper academic study?" Mark recognized the signs. Elena's perfectionist nature, which had made her an excellent engineer, was becoming destructive under the pressure of their discovery. She was second guessing every decision, re examining every photograph, convinced that any mistake on their part could damage irreplaceable historical evidence. The anxiety attacks started a week later. Elena would be working normally, cataloging artifacts or updating their site maps, when suddenly she couldn't breathe. Her chest would tighten, her vision would blur, and panic would flood through her system. The first time it happened, Mark thought she was having a heart attack. He'd rushed her to the emergency room in town, where doctors found nothing physically wrong, but recommended she see someone about stress management. "I can't handle this," Elena confessed to Mark one evening after another sleepless night. "Every day I wake up knowing that we're responsible for preserving something that could change how the world understands ancient American history. Every decision we make could determine whether this knowledge survives or gets destroyed by bureaucratic incompetence or academic politics." Mark had been struggling with his own obsessions, but they manifested differently. While Elena worried about documentation and preservation, he became consumed with understanding every detail of the underground city. He'd spend entire days below ground, mapping passages they'd already explored, photographing artifacts they'd already cataloged, measuring rooms they'd already documented. His construction background made him focus on the engineering marvels they'd discovered. How had the ancient builders moved massive stone blocks through narrow tunnels? What techniques had they used to create ventilation systems that still functioned after 1,000 years? How had they achieved the precise stone cutting that made their walls earthquake resistant? But his obsession was becoming unhealthy. Elena would find him in the underground city at dawn, having spent the entire night taking measurements and making sketches. He'd emerge exhausted, covered in limestone dust, his eyes red from strain. He was losing weight, forgetting to eat while he worked, ignoring basic safety protocols in his eagerness to understand every aspect of their discovery. The strain began affecting their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. They'd bought the farm together, dreaming of building a sustainable life away from the pressures of city jobs and urban stress. Instead, they found themselves pulled in different directions by the magnitude of their accidental discovery. Elena wanted to move faster, to bring in experts immediately and establish proper preservation protocols before something happened to damage the site. Mark wanted to slow down, to understand everything themselves before involving outsiders who might not appreciate the city's significance or respect their rights as property owners. Their conversations became tense, filled with the kind of careful politeness that indicated deeper conflicts neither wanted to address directly. Elena would suggest contacting Dr. Running Bear immediately, worried that delays were putting the site at risk. Mark would argue for more documentation, more preparation, more control over the process. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in late summer. Elena had spent the day updating their photographic database, while Mark explored a new passage he'd discovered in the city's workshop district. When he emerged after dark, excited about carved symbols that might indicate the city's original name, he found Elena sitting in their kitchen with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "I lie awake every night thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if the government seizes our property? What if academics destroy the site with careless excavation? What if we've already damaged something irreplaceable with our amateur exploration?" Mark sat beside her, finally seeing how the pressure had been affecting the woman he loved. Her engineering precision, which had made her invaluable in documenting their discovery, had become a source of paralyzing anxiety. Every small imperfection in their work felt like a betrayal of the ancient civilization that had trusted them with its legacy. I dream about the guardian, Elena continued, referring to the preserved figure in the deepest chamber. I dream that he's disappointed in us, that we're not worthy custodians of his people's knowledge. We're just two people who bought a farm and stumbled into something we're not qualified to handle. Mark took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the summer warmth. We are qualified, he said firmly, not because we have degrees or titles, but because we care. Because we understand that this discovery is bigger than our own interests. But Elena's fears weren't entirely irrational. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, responsible for preserving knowledge that could reshape understanding of human history. The weight of that responsibility was legitimate, overwhelming, and entirely beyond anything they'd prepared for when they'd bought their simple farm. That night, Mark and Elena sat on their front porch, watching stars appear over their 40 acres of Pennsylvania farmland. For the first time in months, they weren't talking about documentation protocols or preservation strategies or the weight of archaeological responsibility. They were just two people who had found each other, bought a farm together, and accidentally stumbled into the discovery of a lifetime. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was the comfortable quiet of partners who'd weathered a crisis and emerged with deeper understanding of what truly mattered. Elena broke the silence first. I've been thinking about what the Guardian would actually want, she said softly. Not what I imagine he'd want, but what the evidence suggests his people valued. Mark turned to look at her, seeing the first peace in her expression that he'd witnessed in weeks. They preserved everything so carefully, Elena continued. The environmental controls, the detailed records, the way they sealed the city to protect it from damage. But they also left it accessible. They wanted someone to find it eventually. Mark nodded slowly. They could have collapsed the tunnels completely, made the city impossible to discover. Instead, they created a puzzle that would eventually be solved by people curious enough and persistent enough to look beneath the surface. That realization had been growing in both their minds over the past difficult weeks. The ancient builders hadn't just hidden their city. They'd preserved it as a gift for future generations, trusting that someday the right people would find it and understand its significance. We are the right people, Elena said with conviction that surprised them both. Not because we're perfect or because we have all the answers, but because we found it and we care enough to do right by it. The next morning, they began making calls. Dr. Sarah Running Bear arrived first, driving from New Mexico in a battered pickup truck loaded with respectful excavation equipment. She was smaller than Elena had expected, a compact woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. But her credentials were impeccable, and more importantly, her approach to archaeology emphasized community partnership over institutional control. Mark and Elena led her through the underground city slowly, watching her face change from professional interest to wonder to something approaching reverence. She photographed nothing without asking permission first. She touched artifacts only when invited. She spent long minutes in the Guardian's chamber, not examining the preserved remains, but simply standing quietly in acknowledgement of the sacred space. This is extraordinary, Dr. Running Bear said, finally, as they emerged into daylight. But you already know that. The question is, what do you want to happen next? Elena appreciated the directness. We want it studied properly, preserved permanently, and protected from exploitation. But we also want to remain involved as partners, not just property owners who get pushed aside once the experts arrive. Dr. Running Bear smiled. That's exactly what should happen. And I know how to make it work. Over the following weeks, she helped them establish the Millfield Archaeological Foundation, a private organization that would fund and oversee all research while keeping ownership firmly in Mark and Elena's hands. Dr. Marcus Webb joined the team, bringing expertise in pre-Columbian civilizations and connections to ethical funding sources. Thomas Crow Feather represented the tribal council, ensuring cultural sensitivity and indigenous perspectives remained central to all decisions. The Foundation's first major success came from an unexpected source. Michael Rothschild, the tech billionaire whose family had built retail empires, had developed an interest in archaeological preservation after his own experiences with recovered heritage. When Dr. Running Bear approached his foundation with preliminary evidence from the underground city, his response was immediate and generous. This could change everything we know about ancient American civilizations, he said during a video conference with Mark and Elena. I want to fund proper excavation, documentation, and preservation. But more than that, I want to support your vision of community-centered archaeology. The Rothschild Foundation committed to 20 years of funding, enough to support careful excavation, advanced preservation technology, and ongoing research. But the partnership went beyond money. Rothschild understood the importance of maintaining local control, of ensuring discoveries benefited the communities where they were found rather than just enriching distant institutions. Mark and Elena transformed their farm into something neither had originally envisioned, but both embraced wholeheartedly. The upper fields remained agricultural, providing sustainable food production and income through organic farming techniques. But the area around the barn became a carefully managed research center with climate-controlled facilities for artifact preservation and laboratories for ongoing analysis. The underground city itself remained largely untouched, preserved exactly as they'd found it, while teams of specialists documented every detail with non-invasive techniques. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the full extent of the settlement, showing passages and chambers that stretched far beyond what Mark and Elena had initially explored. But excavation proceeded slowly, respectfully, with every decision guided by principles of preservation rather than discovery. The tribal council's involvement proved crucial in ways none of them had anticipated. Thomas Crowfeather's knowledge of local indigenous traditions helped interpret aspects of the city that academic archaeology might have missed. His people's protocols for honoring sacred spaces ensured the ancient builders' remains were treated with appropriate reverence. Most importantly, the tribal partnership provided legitimacy and community support that protected the site from potential government interference. Within 2 years, the Millfield site had become a model for ethical archaeology. Universities sent graduate students to learn community-based excavation techniques. Government agencies consulted the foundation on best practices for balancing scientific research with property rights. International organizations studying similar underground cities sought partnerships and shared expertise. But for Mark and Elena, the most meaningful changes were personal. Their anxiety about inadequate stewardship had transformed into confident partnership with world-class experts. Their fear of losing control had become collaborative leadership of groundbreaking research. Their simple dream of sustainable farming had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that ordinary people could become extraordinary guardians of irreplaceable human heritage. The underground city remained mysterious, its builders' full story still emerging through careful study. But its modern legacy was already clear. Mark and Elena had proven that doing right by history didn't require sacrificing personal dreams or community values. Sometimes the most important discoveries weren't about what lay buried in the past, but about what could be built in the future when people chose partnership over exploitation, community over profit, and preservation over personal gain.